November 19, 1944. The transport truck rattled down the muddy road toward Camp Livingston, Louisiana, carrying its cargo of defeated enemies. Inside, 43 German women sat in silence, their gray auxiliary uniforms torn and stained from months of retreat across France. They had been captured during the final desperate days of the German withdrawal, plucked from chaos and sent across an ocean to a country they had been taught to hate and fear. Now they were about to discover just how wrong everything they had been told truly was. 24-year-old Marlene Vogel pressed her face against the small window opening, watching the strange Louisiana landscape pass by. Tall pine trees lined the road, so different from the bombed-out forests of Europe. Her stomach cramped with hunger, a sensation that had become her constant companion over the past 8 months. The women around her were equally gaunt, their faces hollowed by deprivation and stress. They had eaten nothing but watery soup and stale bread for weeks. During their journey from the front lines to this American prison camp, the propaganda they had been fed throughout their service in the Women's Auxiliary Corps painted America as a nation on the brink of collapse. Decadent capitalists hoarding resources while their own people starved, the officers had told them. A weak country that would crumble under the might of the Reich. But as the truck passed through the camp gates, Marlene noticed something that contradicted everything she had been taught. The American guards looked healthy. Not just healthy, but well-fed. Their uniforms clean and properly fitted. Some were even laughing as they went about their duties. The truck stopped in front of a long wooden barracks, and the women were ordered to disembark. Marlene's legs nearly gave out as she stepped down onto American soil for the first time. Beside her, her friend Anna Weber clutched her arm for support. Anna had been a nurse before joining the Auxiliary Corps, and her medical training made her acutely aware of their deteriorating physical condition. "We're malnourished," she whispered in German. "Severely. If we don't get proper food soon, some of the older women won't survive the winter." An American officer approached them, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a firm bearing. Captain Elizabeth Chen introduced herself through a translator, explaining the camp rules and procedures, but Marlene barely heard the words. Her attention had been captured by something else entirely. Behind the captain, visible through the open door of a nearby building, American soldiers were eating lunch, and the portions on their plates were larger than anything Marlene had seen in 2 years. The women were led into their barracks, a drafty but sturdy structure with rows of metal cots. As they settled into their new quarters, whispered conversations began to spread through the group. Had they seen the food? Could it be real? Or was this some kind of elaborate deception, a way to make them lower their guard before the real cruelty began? They had been taught that Americans were masters of psychological warfare. None of them could have imagined that the greatest shock was yet to come. The first morning at Camp Livingston began with a surprise that left the German women speechless. They were marched to the mess hall at 0600 hours, expecting the thin gruel and hard bread that had sustained them during their capture and transport. What they found instead challenged everything they thought they knew about wartime scarcity and enemy cruelty. Marlene stood in line with her metal tray, watching in disbelief as American kitchen staff loaded her plate with food. Real eggs, not the powdered substitute she had grown accustomed to in Germany. 2 thick slices of bread with actual butter, not the ersatz margarine that tasted like oil and chemicals. A cup of coffee that smelled rich and dark, nothing like the acorn-based substitute they had been drinking for years. And strips of bacon, crispy and fragrant, more meat than she had seen in a single meal since 1942. Anna stood beside her, tears forming in her eyes as she stared at her plate. "This can't be for us," she whispered in German. "This must be a mistake. They've given us officers' rations by accident." But as they looked around the mess hall, they saw that every German prisoner was receiving the same generous portions. The American guards were eating similar meals, treating this abundance as completely ordinary. The women sat at long wooden tables, most of them too stunned to begin eating. Marlene picked up her fork with trembling hands, half expecting someone to rush over and snatch the tray away, laughing at the cruel joke. But no one came. The American staff simply went about their business, some even smiling at the prisoners as they passed. The first bite of real egg nearly made Marlene weep. The texture, the flavor, the richness of it all reminded her of Sunday breakfasts before the war, when her father was still alive and her family's bakery in Hamburg was still standing. Around her, other women were having similar reactions. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite, as if it might be their last real meal. Others devoured their food quickly, driven by months of deprivation and the fear that this unexpected bounty might disappear at any moment. Greta Hoffmann, a former radio operator from Berlin, leaned across the table toward Marlene. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "We were told that America was suffering, that their people were rationing and going hungry because of the war. But look at this, look at what they're giving us, and we're prisoners, their enemies." Her voice carried a mixture of confusion and something else, something that might have been the first crack in years of propaganda. Captain Chen stood at the front of the mess hall, observing the prisoners' reactions with an expression that was difficult to read. Later, Marlene would learn that the captain had specifically requested this assignment because she believed in treating prisoners with dignity. But in that moment, all Marlene could think about was the bitter irony. She had crossed an ocean as a prisoner of war, expecting cruelty and deprivation. Instead, she was eating better than she had in 3 years of serving the Reich. Marlene lay on her cot that first night, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. Her stomach was full for the first time in months, and the unfamiliar sensation kept her awake. But more than that, her mind churned with memories of everything she had been taught, every piece of propaganda that now seemed like obvious lies in the face of what she had witnessed. She remembered her recruitment into the Women's Auxiliary Corps in the spring of 1943. She had been working in her family's bakery in Hamburg, watching their flour rations shrink month by month until they could barely keep the business running. When the recruitment officers came through the neighborhood, they painted a picture of service and purpose. Germany needed its women, they said. The enemies surrounding the fatherland were ruthless and cruel, determined to destroy German culture and enslave its people. The training had been intense, but not harsh. Marlene learned communications protocols, basic military structure, and most importantly, she learned about the enemies they faced. The instructors spent hours describing the various Allied nations, but they focused particular attention on America. The lectures about American society were filled with contempt and mockery. Americans were soft, they were told, decadent capitalists who had grown fat on exploitation while the rest of the world suffered. Their soldiers were undisciplined. Their society was fracturing under the weight of its own corruption. Most importantly, they were taught that Americans were cruel beneath their veneer of civilization. If captured, the instructors warned, expect no mercy. Americans would use psychological torture, starvation, and humiliation to break German prisoners. They would violate the Geneva Convention while pretending to uphold it. Better to die fighting than to fall into American hands, one instructor had said during a particularly intense lecture. Anna had been in the same training class, and Marlene remembered how they would whisper to each other at night in the barracks, processing everything they were learning. Anna, with her medical background, had questioned some of the claims about American healthcare and nutrition. How could a nation be simultaneously starving its own people and maintaining a massive military force? The instructors had explanations ready. American capitalism meant resources flowed only to the wealthy and the military, while ordinary citizens suffered in silence. When they were deployed to France in early 1944, those teachings seemed confirmed by what they saw: the bombing campaigns, the destruction of cities, the civilian casualties. Surely this was evidence of American ruthlessness. They were serving at a communications post when the Allied advance became unstoppable. The retreat was chaos, and capture came suddenly during what should have been a routine evacuation. Now, Lying in a American prison camp with a full stomach and a warm blanket, Marlene was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. If the propaganda had been so completely wrong about American abundance and the treatment of prisoners, what else had been lies? The question was terrifying because it threatened to unravel everything she had believed about her service, her country, and her own choices. The second week at Camp Livingston brought a routine that the German women struggled to comprehend. Every morning, they received breakfast that would have fed a German family for an entire day. Lunch consisted of sandwiches made with real meat, fresh vegetables, and bread that was soft and white, nothing like the dense, dark loaves they had eaten back home. Dinner rotated through dishes the women had never heard of, casseroles and roasts and stews that seemed impossibly rich. Marlene found herself gaining weight for the first time in 2 years. Her uniforms, which had hung loosely on her frame when she arrived, began to fit properly again. She could see the same transformation in the other women. Faces that had been gaunt and hollow were filling out. Eyes that had been dull with exhaustion were regaining their brightness. Even their hair, which had become brittle and thin from malnutrition, seemed healthier. But the abundance created a strange new form of suffering. Every meal became a reminder of what they had left behind. While Marlene ate beef stew with potatoes and carrots, her mother and younger sister were somewhere in bombed-out Hamburg, likely surviving on ration cards that provided barely enough calories to stay alive. While Anna drank real milk with her breakfast, her elderly parents in Stuttgart were probably drinking ersatz coffee made from chicory and acorns. The guilt was overwhelming. Greta stopped eating after the first week, pushing her tray away at every meal until Captain Chen noticed and ordered her to the infirmary. "My family is starving," Greta told the camp doctor through tears. "How can I eat like this knowing what they're enduring?" The doctor, a kind man named Major Williams, had no easy answer. He could only ensure she received enough nutrition to survive while she wrestled with her conscience. The psychological impact extended beyond guilt. The women began to realize they had been lied to about something fundamental. If American prisoners of war were being fed this well, what did that say about the stories they had been told regarding American cruelty? Marlene remembered the lectures about how Americans would starve their captives, would use food deprivation as a weapon of torture. Yet, here she was, eating 3 full meals a day, plus occasional snacks that the guards would share during work details. Anna, with her medical training, tried to make sense of it scientifically. "The Geneva Convention requires adequate nutrition for prisoners," she explained to a group of women one evening. "But this exceeds adequate. This is generous by any standard. Even before the war, most German families didn't eat this well on a daily basis." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. If Americans were exceeding their legal obligations to feed enemy prisoners, what did that reveal about their society and values? The women began to call their rations punishment by kindness, a bitter joke that contained uncomfortable truth. Every meal forced them to confront the lies they had been taught. Every full stomach reminded them of the hunger back home. And slowly, reluctantly, they began to wonder if perhaps they had been fighting for the wrong side all along. 3 weeks into their captivity, Marlene, Anna, and Greta were assigned to kitchen duty. Captain Chen explained that prisoners who demonstrated good behavior and cooperation could work in various camp facilities, earning small privileges and helping to pass the time. The 3 women reported to the main camp kitchen at 0500 hours on a cold December morning, uncertain what to expect. Sergeant Patricia Morrison greeted them at the kitchen entrance. She was a large woman in her 40s with strong arms and a warm smile that seemed out of place in a military setting. Her family had run a restaurant in New Orleans before the war, and she had enlisted in the Army after her husband died at Pearl Harbor. She spoke no German, and the women's English was limited, but she communicated through gestures and demonstrations that transcended language barriers. The kitchen was unlike anything Marlene had ever seen. Even the finest restaurants in Hamburg before the war had not been equipped like this. Multiple ovens, enormous refrigerators, and storage rooms filled with ingredients that had become rare luxuries in Germany. Sacks of white flour stacked to the ceiling, crates of fresh vegetables delivered daily, a walk-in freezer containing beef, pork, chicken, and fish in quantities that seemed impossible. Sergeant Morrison started them on simple tasks. Marlene was assigned to peel potatoes, a job that seemed straightforward until she saw the quantity. Bushel after bushel of perfect, unblemished potatoes, more than she would have seen in a month at her family's bakery during the war. She worked mechanically, her hands remembering the familiar motion while her mind tried to process the abundance surrounding her. Anna was given the task of washing vegetables. Fresh lettuce, tomatoes, carrots, and celery passed through her hands in an endless stream. She found herself crying silently as she worked, thinking of her mother's small victory garden in Stuttgart, where they had struggled to grow enough vegetables to supplement their meager rations. Here, more fresh produce would be prepared in a single meal than her entire neighborhood had seen in a month. Greta was assigned to work with the baking station, and it nearly broke her. She watched as one of the American cooks measured out butter, real butter, using more in a single batch of biscuits than most German households received in their monthly ration. The cook, a cheerful young woman named Private Davis, chatted constantly while she worked, completely unaware that her casual use of precious ingredients was devastating to watch. During their first lunch break, the three German women sat together in a corner of the kitchen, picking at the sandwiches Sergeant Morrison had made for them. "This isn't real," Greta whispered. "This can't be sustainable. They must be showing off, using up reserves to impress us or confuse us. No country can maintain this level of abundance during wartime." But Anna shook her head slowly. "Look at how casual they are about it. This is normal for them. This is just an ordinary day in an ordinary military kitchen." Marlene said nothing. She was thinking about her father, who had died in 1942, partly from malnutrition, after giving most of his food rations to his family. He had believed until his death that Germany's sacrifices would lead to victory and a better future. Now, his daughter stood in an enemy kitchen, surrounded by abundance he could never have imagined. The fourth Thursday of November brought a change to the kitchen routine. Sergeant Morrison arrived early, carrying a thick cookbook and wearing an expression of determined concentration. Through gestures and her limited German vocabulary, she made the kitchen staff understand that today was special, Thanksgiving, a day when Americans expressed gratitude through elaborate meals shared with family and friends. Even in a military camp, even during wartime, the tradition would be honored. Marlene and the other German women watched as Sergeant Morrison and her American staff began preparations for a feast that seemed to belong in a fairy tale. Turkey, multiple turkeys, each one larger than any bird Marlene had seen. Sweet potatoes, green beans, fresh bread rolls and pies made with real sugar and butter. But the dish that captured Marlene's attention was something Sergeant Morrison called beef stroganoff, a recipe she explained was her grandmother's specialty, brought to Louisiana by Russian immigrants generations ago. The preparation process was mesmerizing and disturbing in equal measure. Sergeant Morrison started with beef tenderloin, the finest cut of meat, the kind that had disappeared from German markets by 1940. She cut it into strips with practiced efficiency, easily using 5 pounds of prime beef for a single dish. Marlene stood nearby, supposedly preparing vegetables, but unable to look away from this demonstration of impossible abundance. Next came the onions and mushrooms, sautéed in real butter until they were golden and fragrant. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and savory, making Marlene's mouth water despite her conflicted feelings. Then Sergeant Morrison reached for the cream, heavy cream, fresh and white, poured into the pan in quantities that seemed obscene. In Germany, cream had become a memory, something mentioned in old recipes but no longer available even to those with money and connections. Anna moved closer to watch as Sergeant Morrison added beef broth, paprika, and other seasonings to the mixture. the sauce began to simmer, transforming into something luxurious and velvety. The sergeant stirred it carefully, tasted it, and added a bit more salt. Her casualness about the whole process was perhaps more shocking than the ingredients themselves. This wasn't a special occasion dish for her. This was just Thursday dinner for a military camp in Louisiana. Greta had stopped working entirely, standing frozen with a half-peeled potato in her hand. "That amount of cream," she said quietly in German, "would have cost a month's wages on the black market in Berlin. And she's using it for one dinner, one single meal for prisoners." Her voice carried disbelief and something that might have been anger, though whether directed at Sergeant Morrison or at their own government for the deprivation they had endured was unclear. The stroganoff simmered for nearly an hour, filling the entire kitchen with an aroma that was almost painful in its richness. Sergeant Morrison prepared egg noodles to serve it over, another ingredient that had become scarce in Germany. When she finally ladled a portion into a serving dish for presentation, the German women gathered around to stare. The creamy sauce, studded with tender beef and mushrooms, looked like something from a royal banquet, not a prison camp meal. Sergeant Morrison noticed the three German women staring at the beef stroganoff with expressions she had seen before on the faces of refugees and displaced persons. It was a look that combined hunger with disbelief, desire with shame. She had been working with prisoners long enough to recognize when someone was struggling with more than just physical deprivation. These women were wrestling with the implications of what they were witnessing. She ladled a generous portion of stroganoff over egg noodles and set it aside, then turned to face Marlene, Anna, and Greta. Through a combination of gestures and simple English words, she indicated that she wanted them to taste the dish before it was served to the camp. The three women looked at each other with uncertainty and fear. This seemed like a test or perhaps a trap. Why would an American sergeant offer enemy prisoners the chance to eat before the guards? Private Davis, the young cook who had been working alongside them, sensed their hesitation. She spoke slowly in English, knowing they would only understand fragments. "It's okay. Sergeant Morrison always has kitchen helpers taste everything. She says you can't serve food properly if you don't know how it tastes. It's not special treatment, just kitchen rules." Her friendly tone and genuine smile helped ease some of the tension. Captain Chen entered the kitchen at that moment, drawn by the rich aromas filling the building. She observed the scene and understood immediately what was happening. Walking over to the German women, she spoke through the camp's translator who had accompanied her. "This is a normal practice in American military kitchens. Those who prepare the food are expected to know what they're serving. You're not being given special privileges. You're being treated like kitchen staff." Marlene felt her hand shaking as she accepted the small plate Sergeant Morrison offered. The portion was modest compared to what would be served to the troops, but to her it looked enormous. The creamy sauce coated the tender strips of beef, and steam rose from the egg noodles underneath. Anna and Greta received similar plates, and the three women stood together, uncertain whether they were allowed to sit or should remain standing. Sergeant Morrison pulled out stools at the prep counter and patted them, indicating they should sit. She then served herself a small portion and sat with them, demonstrating that this was indeed a normal kitchen practice, not some elaborate psychological game. Private Davis joined them as well, chatting cheerfully about how her grandmother made stroganoff differently, using sour cream instead of heavy cream. The moment felt surreal to Marlene. Here she sat in an enemy kitchen, surrounded by abundance that contradicted everything she had been taught, about to eat a meal that represented more luxury than she had experienced in years. Sergeant Morrison raised her fork as if offering a toast, and said something in English that the translator rendered as, "To good food and the people who make it." Marlene lifted the fork to her lips slowly, as if the stroganoff might vanish if she moved too quickly. The first bite was unlike anything she had experienced in 3 years of war. The beef was so tender it nearly dissolved on her tongue. The cream sauce was rich and velvety, seasoned perfectly with paprika and herbs she couldn't quite identify. The egg noodles provided a subtle base that allowed the other flavors to shine. It was, quite simply, the most delicious thing she had tasted since before the war began. She closed her eyes involuntarily, and suddenly she was back in Hamburg in 1938. Her father's bakery was still thriving, and Sunday dinners were elaborate affairs with multiple courses. Her mother would prepare schnitzel with mushroom sauce, and the family would gather around the table, talking and laughing. The memory was so vivid it hurt. When she opened her eyes, she was still in the Louisiana prison camp kitchen, still an enemy captive, still separated from everything she had known. Beside her, Anna had taken her first bite and stopped moving. Entirely. Her fork remained suspended halfway between the plate and her mouth, and tears began streaming down her face. She made no sound, but her shoulders shook with silent sobs. The combination of exquisite flavor and the memories it triggered, the contrast between this abundance and the starvation she knew her family was enduring, was simply too much to bear. Greta ate mechanically, chewing and swallowing with a grim expression. She finished her small portion quickly and set down her fork with more force than necessary. When she spoke, her voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "My brother died last winter. We received the letter in March. He was defending the fatherland on the Eastern Front, and he died hungry and cold. And here I sit, a prisoner, eating better than he ever did while serving our country." Sergeant Morrison didn't understand the German words, but she recognized the tone. She had seen this reaction before, this mixture of grief and confusion that came when prisoners confronted the reality of American abundance. She reached across the counter and gently touched Greta's hand, a gesture of comfort that transcended language barriers. The simple human kindness of the touch made Greta cry harder. Private Davis looked uncomfortable, uncertain how to respond to the emotional breakdown happening in her kitchen. Captain Chen, still observing from nearby, decided to intervene. Through the translator, she addressed the three German women directly. "What you're feeling is normal. Many prisoners experience this when they first eat American food. You were told lies about us, about our country, about what life is like here. Food has a way of revealing truth that propaganda cannot hide." Marlene finally found her voice, speaking in halting English that she had been learning from Sergeant Chen's lessons. "In Germany, we have nothing like this, not for many years. This food, it is like dreams, like memories. We think America is poor, suffering, but you give prisoners food for kings." The Thanksgiving dinner service began at 1700 hours, and Marlene helped serve the beef stroganoff to American soldiers who filed through the mess line with casual efficiency. They thanked her automatically, most of them barely glancing at the German prisoner serving their food. To them, this was just Thursday dinner, nothing particularly special except for the holiday designation. They had no idea that the woman ladling stroganoff onto their plates was experiencing a complete restructuring of her understanding of the world. Anna worked at the dessert station, serving slices of pumpkin pie topped with real whipped cream. Each pie she served represented ingredients that would have been impossible to obtain in Germany at any price. Sugar, butter, cream, eggs, all in quantities that seemed criminal when she thought about children starving in Berlin. She watched American soldiers take their desserts, saw some of them leave portions uneaten on their plates, and had to excuse herself twice to cry in the storage room. Greta stood at the cleaning station, scraping plates before they went to the washing area, watching perfectly good food being thrown away as waste was almost more than she could bear. Pieces of bread, portions of stroganoff that soldiers hadn't finished, bits of vegetables and potatoes, all of it going into trash bins while her countrymen were starving. The casual wastefulness of abundance was its own form of torture. When the dinner service finally ended and the kitchen staff sat down to eat their own meal, the three German women were invited to join them. This time, the portions were not modest samples, but full servings. Sergeant Morrison heaped their plates with stroganoff, adding extra helpings of the tender beef. She served them vegetables, rolls with butter, and promised them pie once they had finished the main course. The other American kitchen staff treated this as completely normal, continuing their conversations and jokes, as if having German prisoners dining with them was unremarkable. Marlene tried to eat slowly, to savor each bite and not appear desperate or greedy. But her body, starved for so long, wanted to consume everything as quickly as possible. She forced herself to maintain composure, to eat with the same casual efficiency as the Americans around her. Inside, however, she was falling apart. Every bite was a revelation. Every mouthful of creamy sauce contradicted years of propaganda about American deprivation and weakness. Private Davis noticed Marlene's careful eating and smiled kindly. "It's okay to enjoy it," she said in simple English. "Food is meant to be enjoyed. That's what Sergeant Morrison always says. Good food brings people together, makes them remember they're human." The translator rendered this into German, and Marlene felt fresh tears threatening. The simple philosophy that food should be enjoyed, that meals were about more than mere survival, had become foreign to her during years of rationing and deprivation. Anna finally spoke what all three women were thinking. "We were told that Americans were starving because of the war, that your economy was collapsing and your people were suffering. But this," she gestured at the abundant meal, "this is not suffering. You feed your prisoners better than our soldiers ate, better than our officers ate. What else were we told? That was a lie." The beef stroganoff dinner marked a turning point in the relationship between the German prisoners and their American captors. In the days that followed, small gestures of kindness began to multiply throughout the camp. What had started as proper adherence to the Geneva Convention evolved into something that resembled genuine human compassion. The Americans seemed unable to maintain the emotional distance that war supposedly required between captors and captives. Sergeant Morrison started a tradition of teaching the three kitchen workers how to prepare American dishes. She would demonstrate techniques while speaking slowly in English, encouraging them to practice the language through cooking vocabulary. Marlene learned words like simmer, sauté, and whisk, while discovering that American cuisine was far more sophisticated than the propaganda had suggested. Each lesson was also a lesson in abundance, as Morrison casually used ingredients that would have been black market treasures in Germany. Private Davis brought her personal collection of recipe cards to share with Anna, who had expressed interest in American baking. The two women spent their breaks looking through cards decorated with hand-drawn illustrations, Davis explaining family traditions, while Anna practiced reading English. The recipes called for quantities of sugar, butter, and eggs that made Anna shake her head in disbelief. "Your grandmother used 2 cups of sugar for 1 cake?" she asked. Davis laughed and said that was actually a modest amount by American standards. Captain Chen continued her informal English lessons during evening hours, and the number of German prisoners attending grew each week. What began with 5 women expanded to 20, then 30. They were hungry for the language that would help them understand their captors and the country that held them. Chen taught them practical phrases, but also cultural concepts that couldn't be translated directly. She explained American ideas about individual freedom, democracy, and the belief that former enemies could become friends. The guards began sharing small luxuries with prisoners during work details. A piece of chocolate here, a magazine there, small gestures that seemed insignificant to Americans but were precious to women who had lived through years of deprivation. Corporal James Reed, whose family owned a tobacco farm in Virginia, would share his cigarettes with prisoners who smoked, sitting with them during breaks and attempting conversations in broken German mixed with hand gestures. Greta found an unexpected friendship with Private First Class Maria Rodriguez, a mechanic from Texas who maintained the camp's vehicles. Rodriguez had noticed Greta's fascination with engines during a work detail and invited her to assist with repairs. The two women communicated through the universal language of tools and machinery, developing a camaraderie that transcended national boundaries. Rodriguez would share her lunch with Greta, always including extra portions because she understood that the German woman was still recovering from months of malnutrition. The small kindnesses accumulated like drops of water filling a vessel. Each gesture chipped away at the propaganda that had defined these women's understanding of America and Americans. They had expected cruelty and found compassion. They had expected deprivation and found abundance. Most confusing of all, they had expected hatred and found curiosity, interest, and a willingness to see them as individuals rather than generic enemies. December brought the first mail delivery from Germany, processed through the International Red Cross and heavily censored by both German and American authorities. Not every prisoner received letters, and those who did often wished they hadn't. The news from home was universally devastating. Marlene sat on her cot holding a thin envelope postmarked from Hamburg, afraid to open it. She had written to her mother and sister immediately upon arrival at Camp Livingston, but had received no response until now. The letter was brief, written in her mother's shaky handwriting on paper so thin it was nearly transparent. Her sister Ilse had died in an Allied bombing raid in September. The bakery was destroyed. Their apartment building was gone. Her mother was living in the basement of a partially collapsed church with 30 other refugees, surviving on rations that provided less than 1,000 calories per day. The letter ended with a sentence that haunted Marlene. "I hope wherever you are, you have enough to eat." That is all a mother can wish for her daughter now. Anna received news that her father had died of pneumonia in October, weakened by malnutrition and the stress of constant bombing. Her mother was alone in Stuttgart, unable to work because of injuries sustained during an air raid. The letter contained no blame, no anger at Anna for being captured, only a desperate plea for any information about when she might return home. "We need you," her mother wrote, "but I also pray you are somewhere safe, somewhere the bombs cannot reach you." Greta's letter was the most devastating. Her entire family was gone. Her parents, her 2 younger sisters, and her brother who had died on the Eastern Front. A neighbor who had survived wrote to inform her that their apartment building had taken a direct hit in November. There were no bodies to bury, no graves to visit. Her family had simply ceased to exist. The neighbor ended with bitter words, "You are lucky to be far away from this hell. At least you will survive." The barracks that evening was filled with quiet weeping. Of the 43 German women at Camp Livingston, 31 had received letters. The news ranged from bad to catastrophic. Families dead, cities destroyed, hunger and suffering described in language that could pass through censors. The women who received no letters suffered their own special torment, wondering if the silence meant death or simply that mail wasn't getting through. Marlene lay on her cot that night, thinking about her mother, eating perhaps a bowl of thin soup while her daughter, the prisoner, had consumed beef stroganoff made with heavy cream. The guilt was crushing. She thought about the Thanksgiving dinner, about the casual abundance of the American kitchen, about the butter and sugar and meat that seemed endless. Her sister had died hungry while Marlene gained weight in enemy captivity. Anna couldn't stop crying, pressing her face into her pillow to muffle the sounds. She had been trained as a nurse, taught to save lives and ease suffering. But she had been serving the wrong side while her father died alone in a bombed-out city. What good was medical knowledge when she couldn't help the people who mattered most? What purpose did survival serve when everyone she loved was gone? The days following the letter delivery were the darkest period at Camp Livingston. The German prisoners moved through their routines mechanically, their eyes hollow with grief and guilt. The Americans tried to offer comfort, but found themselves helpless in the face of such profound loss. How could you console someone eating 3 meals a day when their family was starving? How could you offer hope to women whose entire worlds had been destroyed? Marlene stopped eating properly. She would take her tray in the mess hall and then pick at the food, consuming barely enough to sustain herself. When Sergeant Morrison noticed and asked what was wrong, Marlene struggled to explain in her imperfect English. "My mother has no food. My sister is dead. I eat this rich food, and they have nothing. It is not right. I should not eat when they cannot." Captain Chen called Marlene to her office for a conversation that would prove pivotal. Through careful words and genuine compassion, she tried to help Marlene understand a difficult truth. "Starving yourself doesn't feed your mother," Chen said gently. "Your suffering here doesn't reduce her suffering there. The world doesn't work that way. All you accomplish by refusing food is making yourself sick, and that helps no one." Marlene shook her head stubbornly. "But how can I deserve this when she has nothing? I am prisoner. I am enemy. She is innocent woman in Hamburg. Why should I eat beef stroganoff while she eats nothing?" The question contained genuine anguish, a moral calculation that didn't balance no matter how she tried to make it work. Chen leaned forward, her expression serious. "You're asking the wrong question. The question isn't why you have food and she doesn't. The question is, why did the government you served let its people starve while pursuing a war that couldn't be won? Why did the leaders you trusted send young women like you to fight while citizens at home went hungry?" The words hit Marlene like a physical blow. She had been directing her anger and guilt inward, punishing herself for circumstances beyond her control. But Chen was pointing her toward a different target. The German government had made choices, had prioritized military conquest over civilian welfare, had fed soldiers while citizens starved. And even the soldiers hadn't eaten as well as American prisoners now did. Anna was struggling with similar guilt in a different way. As someone with medical training, she felt responsible for not being there to help. "My father died of pneumonia," she told Dr. Hayes during a conversation in the medical clinic. "Pneumonia is treatable. With proper medicine and nutrition, he might have survived. But I was here, comfortable and well-fed, while he died without proper care." Dr. Hayes listened with the patience of someone who understood survivors' guilt. "You couldn't have saved him even if you'd been there," he said quietly. "From what you've told me, Germany doesn't have the medicines needed to treat pneumonia effectively right now. The medical infrastructure has collapsed. Your presence wouldn't have changed the shortage of penicillin or the lack of proper nutrition to help recovery." January 1945 brought news that would shatter what remained of the German prisoners' understanding of their homeland. Reports began filtering through American newspapers about discoveries the Allied forces were making as they advanced deeper into German territory. At first, the story seemed too horrific to be true. But as more details emerged, accompanied by photographs and eyewitness accounts from American soldiers, the truth became impossible to deny. Captain Chen made the decision to allow the German prisoners access to newspapers and newsreels. Some of her fellow officers questioned this choice, worried about the psychological impact. But Chen believed the women deserved to know the truth about what they had been part of, even unknowingly. She gathered them in the recreation hall and, through translators, prepared them for what they were about to see and read. The newspapers showed grainy photographs of liberation at camps with names the German women had never heard. Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, images of emaciated prisoners, skeletal figures barely alive, mass graves, gas chambers, crematoria. The scale of systematic murder was incomprehensible. These weren't military operations or unfortunate casualties of war. This was deliberate, organized extermination of civilians based on their ethnicity, religion, and political beliefs. Marlene sat frozen, staring at a photograph of children behind barbed wire, their eyes hollow and their bodies wasted by starvation. These children had been deliberately starved while she had served communications posts, believing she was defending her homeland. She had eaten military rations while these innocent people were systematically murdered. The newspaper fell from her trembling hands as she tried to process this new reality. Anna the nurse found the medical aspects most horrifying. Reports described experiments conducted on prisoners without anesthesia, deliberate infections, and torture disguised as research. Everything she had been taught about medical ethics, about the duty to preserve life and ease suffering, had been violated on an industrial scale by German doctors. Her profession, her calling, had been corrupted by the regime she had served. Greta refused to believe it at first. "This is propaganda," she insisted in German, her voice shaking. "The Allies are making this up to justify their bombing of our cities, to make us accept defeat." But as more evidence emerged over the following days, as American soldiers provided first-hand accounts and photographs continued to accumulate, denial became impossible. The horror was real, and it had been happening while ordinary Germans claimed ignorance. The recreation hall became a place of mourning and revelation. Some women wept openly, others sat in stunned silence. A few became physically ill, running to bathrooms to vomit, as the full implications sank in. They had served a regime that committed these atrocities. They had worn its uniform, followed its orders, believed its propaganda. Even if they personally had never harmed anyone, they had been part of the machine that made this possible. Sergeant Morrison found Marlene sitting alone in the kitchen late that night, long after her shift had ended. The German woman was staring at nothing, her face pale and her hands clasped together. The revelations about concentration camps transformed the atmosphere at Camp Livingston in ways that surprised everyone. Instead of the German prisoners retreating into defensive denial, many of them sought out conversations with American staff, desperate to understand how such horrors could have happened under their watch. The mess hall became an unlikely venue for these difficult dialogues, as if breaking bread together made it possible to discuss the unthinkable. Marlene began eating with Sergeant Morrison regularly, using their shared meals as opportunities to ask questions she could barely articulate. "How did we not know?" she asked in halting English during one dinner. "I lived in Hamburg, big city. My family had bakery. We heard nothing about camps like this. Were we blind? Were we choosing not to see?" Morrison had no easy answers, but she listened with compassion and tried to help Marlene navigate her guilt. Anna sought out Dr. Hayes during lunch breaks, needing to understand the medical dimensions of the atrocities. "The doctors who did these experiments," she said, her voice breaking, "they took the same oath I took. They learned the same anatomy, the same principles of healing. How does a healer become a torturer?" Hayes explained that evil often comes not from monsters, but from ordinary people who stop seeing their victims as human. Anna realized with horror that propaganda had tried to do the same to her, teaching her to see Americans as enemies rather than people. The American staff found themselves in the unexpected role of moral counselors. Captain Chen organized evening discussions where German prisoners could ask questions and express their confusion and horror. These sessions were emotionally exhausting for everyone involved. The Germans had to confront their complicity in a system they claimed never to have fully understood. The Americans had to balance appropriate condemnation of Nazi atrocities with compassion for individuals who were genuinely grappling with devastating revelations. Greta struggled most with accepting the truth. During one particularly tense meal with Private Rodriguez, she tried to rationalize. "But the bombing," she said through a translator, "the Allies killed German civilians too. The firebombing of Dresden, of Hamburg. Are these not also war crimes?" Rodriguez didn't flinch from the question. "War is terrible, and people on all sides suffer," she acknowledged. "But there's a difference between civilian casualties in military operations and systematic murder of people in camps. Both are tragic, but they're not morally equivalent." The distinction was crucial, and it took Greta weeks to truly grasp it. The Allied bombing campaigns, however devastating, were aimed at defeating a military enemy. The concentration camps had no military purpose. They existed solely to exterminate people who had been categorized as undesirable. Understanding this difference meant accepting that the regime she had served was fundamentally evil in a way that went beyond ordinary wartime cruelty. Meals at Camp Livingston took on new significance during this period. The act of sharing food became a form of communication that transcended language barriers and national divisions. When Marlene and Sergeant Morrison sat together over beef stew or chicken casserole, they were doing more than eating. They were building trust. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war that had consumed the continent for nearly 6 years was finally over. At Camp Livingston, the announcement was met with celebration by American staff and complicated emotions by German prisoners. They were no longer fighting for their homeland, but their homeland had been utterly defeated. What did that mean for their future? Captain Chen called a general assembly to explain the repatriation procedures. German prisoners across America would be processed and returned to their country over the coming months. Transportation would be arranged through military channels, and the women would be released to displaced persons camps in occupied Germany before being allowed to return to whatever remained of their homes. The news should have brought relief, the promise of freedom and reunion with surviving family members. Instead, it brought dread. Marlene sat with Anna and Greta in the barracks that evening, discussing what return to Germany would mean. They had received more letters from home, each one painting a bleaker picture than the last. Cities lay in ruins. Food was scarce even with Allied relief efforts. The economy had collapsed. Unemployment was universal. But beyond the physical devastation, there was something even more troubling. Germany was now a nation forced to confront its own monstrous actions, and anyone who had served the regime faced suspicion and shame. My mother writes that former Wehrmacht members are treated as pariahs, Anna said quietly. People spit on them in the streets. Nobody will hire them. The Auxiliary Corps members are seen as collaborators, as people who enabled the regime, will return as defeated soldiers to a country that hates what it used to be. The prospect of being treated as villains by their own countrymen added another layer of complexity to their situation. Greta raised a question that had been troubling many of the prisoners. What if we don't want to return immediately? The words hung in the air like a dangerous confession. What if we ask to stay here longer, until Germany stabilizes? The idea seemed absurd on its face. Who would choose to remain in enemy captivity rather than accept freedom? But the more they discussed it, the more sense it made. In America, they were fed 3 meals a day. They had work that gave them purpose. They had learned skills and made connections. Most importantly, they were treated with dignity despite being former enemies. In Germany, they would face starvation, unemployment, social ostracism, and the psychological burden of living in a nation coming to terms with genocide. Which future offered more hope? Marlene thought about the beef stroganoff dinner that had changed her perspective months earlier. That single meal had revealed truths about abundance, about American values, about the lies she had been taught. Since then, she had learned to cook American dishes, improved her English significantly, and developed relationships with people she had been trained to hate. Sergeant Morrison had offered to help her find work if she ever wanted to stay in America. The Henderson family from the local church had expressed interest in sponsoring her immigration. May 15th arrived with unusual tension in the camp. Captain Chen had scheduled a formal meeting to finalize repatriation details. All 43 German prisoners gathered in the recreation hall, their faces reflecting months of internal struggle about what this moment would mean. Most had resigned themselves to returning to Germany despite their fears, but 14 women, led by Marlene, had made a different decision. When Captain Chen asked if anyone had questions about the repatriation process, Marlene stood slowly. Her legs shook beneath her, but her voice remained steady as she spoke in the careful English she had practiced for days. Captain Chen, I must speak for some of us. She paused, gathering courage. We have been discussing among ourselves for many weeks. Some of us do not wish to return to Germany immediately. The room fell silent. American guards exchanged confused glances, Even the other German prisoners looked shocked. Captain Chen's expression remained neutral, though her eyes widened slightly. "Please explain what you mean, Marlene." Her tone was careful, neither encouraging nor discouraging. She needed to understand the full implications of what was being requested. Marlene looked at the 13 women standing with her, Anna, Greta, and 10 others who had reached the same impossible conclusion. "Germany is not our home anymore," Marlene continued. "The Germany we served, we discovered it was not the Germany we believed in. We were told lies about everything. About America, about the war, about what our government was doing. We cannot return to a country built on such lies." Anna stood next, her medical training giving her a clinical way to frame their reasoning. "Our families write that there is no food, no work, no future. They tell us former auxiliary members are treated as criminals by our own people. Here we have learned skills, learned English, learned what it means to be treated with dignity. We wish to stay and build new lives where we have found respect." The practical arguments were sound, but they didn't capture the deeper transformation these women had undergone. Greta tried to express what the others felt, but couldn't articulate. "When we arrived here, we expected cruelty. You gave us kindness. We expected starvation. You gave us beef stroganoff. We expected hatred. You gave us the chance to become better people than we were. How can we return to a place that made us who we were when we have discovered who we could be?" Captain Chen was momentarily speechless. In her entire military career, she had never encountered prisoners of war requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept repatriation. The legal implications alone were staggering. The Geneva Convention provided for the return of prisoners to their home countries, not for extended residence in enemy nations. But the emotional and moral dimensions were even more complex. The other German prisoners began reacting with a mixture of shock and understanding. Some felt betrayed, as if those who wanted to stay were abandoning their homeland in its darkest hour. Others admitted they felt the same pull, but lacked the courage to act on it. The barracks would be divided for weeks over this decision. The response from Washington took 3 weeks to arrive, during which time the 14 women who had requested to stay existed in a strange limbo. They continued their work duties with renewed intensity, as if their contributions might influence the decision being made hundreds of miles away. The American staff watched them with a mixture of admiration and concern, aware that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the history of prisoner of war operations. When Captain Chen finally received authorization, the news was both hopeful and daunting. The War Department would not force repatriation on prisoners who genuinely wished to remain in the United States. However, the women would be reclassified as displaced persons rather than prisoners of war. This meant they would no longer receive housing and support from the military camp. They would need civilian sponsors, employment, and housing in American communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. The announcement created immediate practical challenges. Where would these 14 women go? Who would take responsibility for former German soldiers, even auxiliary members who had never fired a weapon? The answer came from an unexpected source. The local communities that had been interacting with the camp through church programs and volunteer work stepped forward with offers of sponsorship. The Henderson family, who had been visiting the camp regularly through their Methodist church outreach, immediately offered to sponsor Marlene. Mrs. Henderson, the school teacher who had helped Marlene improve her English, promised to provide housing and assist in finding employment. "You have a gift for languages," Mrs. Henderson told Marlene during their meeting to finalize arrangements. "I know several businesses in New Orleans that need translators for their European operations. Your German is native, your English is excellent, and I suspect you'll pick up French quickly." Dr. Hayes arranged for Anna to continue her medical training at a hospital in Baton Rouge. He had been so impressed with her work in the camp clinic that he personally vouched for her character and abilities. The hospital administrator, initially skeptical about hiring a former German auxiliary member, agreed to a probationary period after meeting Anna and seeing her genuine dedication to healing. "The war is over," he said. "It's time to start building bridges instead of maintaining walls." Sergeant Morrison offered something even more significant to Greta. Her family's restaurant in New Orleans had been struggling since her husband's death, operated by her aging parents who needed help. Morrison proposed that Greta come work in the kitchen, learning the restaurant business while providing the physical labor her parents could no longer manage. "You've learned to cook American food here," Morrison told Greta, "but I can teach you Louisiana cooking, which is something special altogether. Creole, Cajun, all the traditions that make New Orleans food unique." The other 11 women found similar arrangements. Local families, businesses, and church groups offered sponsorship and support. What had seemed impossible just weeks earlier was becoming reality through the collective effort of Americans who believed in second chances. November 1965. The small restaurant in the French Quarter of New Orleans was closed to the public for a private event. Inside, Marlene Weber Henderson stood in the kitchen, preparing beef stroganoff using the recipe Sergeant Patricia Morrison had taught her 20 years earlier. The restaurant was hers now, a successful establishment known for its unique blend of American and German cuisine, a culinary representation of her own blended identity. The occasion was a reunion of the 14 women who had chosen to stay in America after the war. They gathered once a year, always on the anniversary of that first Thanksgiving, when beef stroganoff had changed their understanding of everything they thought they knew. Some years, only a few could attend. This year, all 14 had made the journey, along with several of the Americans who had helped them build new lives. Anna Mueller Hayes arrived first, her American husband and 3 children in tow. She had married Dr. Hayes 5 years after the war ended, a union that raised eyebrows initially, but had proven enduringly happy. She now served as head of nursing at Charity Hospital, training a new generation of medical professionals. Her path from enemy prisoner to respected community leader had been long and sometimes painful, but she had never regretted her decision to stay. Greta Morrison walked in with Patricia Morrison, the 2 women now partners in the restaurant business. Morrison had never remarried after her husband's death at Pearl Harbor, instead pouring her energy into the restaurant and into mentoring Greta. Together, they had expanded the original family establishment into 3 locations across New Orleans. Greta had become a naturalized citizen in 1952 and had brought her surviving mother from Germany to live with her in 1956. Captain Chen, now retired from military service, arrived with Mrs. Henderson. The 2 women had remained close over the years, both taking pride in the success of the women they had helped sponsor. Chen had written a book about her experiences overseeing the German women prisoners at Camp Livingston, a book that had influenced American policies toward displaced persons and refugees throughout the 1950s. As the women gathered around the long table Marlene had prepared, the conversation flowed in a mixture of English and German, with occasional lapses into the Louisiana accent some of them had acquired. They talked about their children, their businesses, their lives in America, but they also remembered those who hadn't made it. 3 of the original 14 had passed away over the years. The women who had chosen repatriation in 1945 remained connected through letters, and several had visited America over the years. Marlene served the beef stroganoff with ceremony, ladling the creamy sauce over egg noodles exactly as Sergeant Morrison had taught her 2 decades earlier. The recipe had become famous in her restaurant, listed on the menu as Liberation Stroganoff, with a brief note explaining its significance. Customers often asked about the story, and Marlene had learned to share it without becoming too emotional.